Have you got a big opening in your home like this one that you're wanting to try and close off? Maybe you've got a beautiful big open plan living space and you've got extra rooms coming off that, but you're finding it really hard to make hot or cold. Well, if that's the case, this is the perfect video for you, because in this video, we are going to be building custom DIY barn doors that you can then use to close off certain sections in your home. I'm using a stunning Tasmanian oak hardwood and I'm going to be building these doors as a feature, but you could also use an MDF or a pine if you wanted to do this project a little bit cheaper. So let's dive into the video and create some stunning barn doors that you can replicate in your home.
As I mentioned, I am building these barn doors completely from scratch. So what I did is I went to the hardware store and I had a bit of a look around at all of the different products available. And then I settled for this marine grained plywood that I was going to use as the actual back panel to the door. So what this is it is plyboard, but there is a really thin layer of a hardwood that is on top of that. It's not a veneer as such, but it's very similar to a veneer in that the timber is not a solid wood timber, but it is a nice, beautiful grain on the front. And that's really what I was looking for, because for my room, it is all a dark room and I really wanted to have a timber product that I was going to keep as a raw timber exposed look to really bring some warmth into the space. The first thing that I needed to do was use the circular saw to cut the panels down to size. You're going to need to measure the opening or the space where you're going to want to put the doors. And for me, I needed to allow for the fact that I was going to have two doors and they needed to be able to meet in the middle. So for me, I worked out that I needed to have 1 meter wide and I wanted them to appear really grand. So I'm actually making them a lot taller than what the opening is. And I've decided to make them 2200 high. Because this back panel is made of chipboard, it is going to be very thin in terms of when you use the circular saw to cut it, you are going to potentially end up with little splinters where you have ripped a little bit out of the actual front panel. What I did to try and rectify this is go along with my orbital sander and try and sand it down flush and try and remove some of those large dents that I've created in the timber where I cut it down to size. You want to try and use a really fine tooth blade to try and make it as easy as possible. However, even though I did use a fine tooth blade, I still had a little bit of detailing on here that I just needed to sand down to fix. But I wasn't too concerned because I'm still going to be building a frame around the outside of this, and on one side of the door you're not going to be able to see those chips at all once I have nailed the frame in place. You're only going to marginally see them on the other side of the door. Now that I've got the height of the door correct, I need to cut it down to size for the width of the door. Because I'm doing this with the circular saw and I don't want to get an uneven line, I want it to be dead straight, otherwise it is going to be visible on the doors. What I'm using is a piece of timber here as a guide for the circular saw to run along. I measured the 1 meter mark multiple different times across the door, and then I used this plank of wood and I lined it up against that mark. I needed to clamp it in place to hold it really still as I run the circular saw along. But you do need to keep in mind that you need to allow for the distance between the edge of the saw and the actual blade of the saw. So for me, that is 33 centimeters, and I needed to put the board 33 centimeters further across than where I actually wanted the blade to cut the line. And then once I had the line cut, I just went along with the orbital sander again and sanded that all smooth. Then I just had to repeat the process on the other door, cutting it down to size for the width. What I would do is I would hold my saw up against where I needed to cut to get the distance of the blade compared to the edge of the saw. I would clamp it in place and then I would check the measurements with a ruler to make sure that it was the same distance. I'll try and zoom in a little bit here and just show you up close what I mean when it comes to the line and then where the actual timber needs to go. You'll see with the ruler that there's an extra 33 centimeters from where the pencil line is to where the actual piece of timber is. So once you've double checked and triple checked all of your measurements, you can go through and cut along that line and cut the door back panel down to size. With my last video, everyone loved that I broke down the price of everything and gave a little bit more detail on the products I've used. So these marine grade plywood panels were $150 each. Now it's time to have some fun and play around with a few different designs. So I got a few image designs from Pinterest in regards to particular styles that you can do on barn doors. And I've got these Tasmanian oak thin panel strips, which were 30 centimeters each. Now these ones are actually solid hardwood, so they were the most expensive component to this project. My two favorite styles when it came to the barn doors was this arrow kind of design and then also the contemporary barn door look with the crosses, but you'll just have to wait and see which one I end up choosing. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm attaching the frame to the door. As I mentioned, this is a plyboard, and so the edges of the ply are not actually very good to look at. You can see all of the individual strips of timber inside that have been glued together. What I'm doing is I'm taking this beautiful hardwood Tasmanian oak and I'm creating a frame around the edge of the door. Now the frame that I've picked is thick enough to cover the ply and then also to just go to the same height as where I'm going to be adding a trim border around the door. I cut them all down to size with the drop saw and then I cut a 45-degree angle on the ends so that I could butt them in perfectly where they would create a beautiful right angle on all of the edges of the door. I then used the Bosch universal tacker with 14mm nails to nail all of this framing around the edge of the door. And to make sure that they're going to be super secure, I also put a bead of liquid nails along each strip before I nailed it on. When you're using the nails to nail on each strip of timber, you don't want to use too many nails because you are going to have to go back along and fill in all of those nail holes, so you're going to get a really nice finish. I wanted to make sure the doors were going to be buttery smooth and that if my kids run their hands along the doors, they're not going to get splinters or anything like that. So I grabbed my orbital sander out with a 240 grit sandpaper and just went along and smoothed out all of the door before applying these wood strips, which were going to be the frame of the door. So I also cut all of these down to length and then also cut a 45-degree angle on each of the ends. When you're doing the cut with the drop saw, you do want to try and get the 45 degrees as close to perfect as you possibly can, but you can use wood filler to go back and fill in any small holes you're going to have, which is then also going to help give you that really professional built door look at the end by making sure it's all very seamless. Then once all of the outside frame was done, it was time to add all of the details. I started by adding a center point and putting a piece of timber across the middle, and then I went from corner to corner and put these cross brackets on. I then added two more cross sections, one on each side of that center point, to create a beautiful arrow look. As I was talking about earlier, once I had all of the timber in place, I just went through with the wood filler and I used the wood filler in the same color as the timber. So I've got an oak wood filler because I don't want the wood filler to be really obvious once I've sanded it all down. And I do want to just have a clear varnish on this. Therefore, if I use the wrong wood filler, I'm going to really easily be able to see where I've put the wood filler and all of the little holes. If you're not doing a raw timber look like I am and you've bought either MDF or pine and you're going to be painting these doors, by all means just use whatever wood filler you've got on hand to fill those holes, because once you paint over them, none of them are going to be visible anyways. Once the wood filler is dry, you're going to come back in with an orbital sander and sand it all down smooth. I also went along all of the strips where they had been joined to the edge pieces and sanded all of them down really flush as well so that there wasn't any lip there. If I just pause the video, I'll show you up close that in some spots there was a little bit of a rise where the timber was added, which I sanded off. This made the process take a fair bit longer than if I hadn't have done this, but once again, it's really going to create that really professional look. And because I'm sinking in so much money to the timber and trying to create a really custom look with these barn doors, I want to try and make it look as seamless and beautiful as possible. Once the sanding was all done, it was time to remove any of the excess sanding dust. I started off by going through with a blower and blowing out all of the little grooves, and then going through with a rag and just wiping it all down. Now it's time to apply the top coat, and there's so many different top coats that you can apply to raw timber. But what I wanted to do was get a few different layers going, and so the first layer I decided that I was just going to paint on by hand. Basically, when you apply a first layer of top coat directly onto timber, you are going to get a little bit of a timber grain rising. Now what you need to do is apply the first coat of the top coat, and then you're going to need to sand off before you apply the next coat to try and get that really smooth finish. Let me show you up close what I mean about the timber grain rising. If I bring the camera in really close here and you look at the timber after I've added the first coat of top coat, you'll be able to see here, it looks like there's almost little splinters rising out of the timber, and when you run your hand along it, it's really quite rough to touch. We definitely don't want the finished product to look like that, and that's why we do our sand in between. So because I'm definitely going to be sanding down in between, I just used a top coat that I had on hand for the first coat. And then I'm going to use a spray can to spray the next few coats of the top coat and get that really smooth finish. And I'm not going to end up with any brush strokes this way. I just worked the way through section by section, so I would paint using the paintbrush all of the trim around the outside, so basically create a frame and then use the paintbrush and go along and paint each of those little sections. When you're doing a sand in between coats, you don't want to use a very heavy grit. So do not use something like an 80 grit or a 120 grit. You want to use a really soft grit so that you're not going to lift too much, and you're just basically sanding off the surface and any of that wood grain that's lifted, so that you're going to get a really buttery smooth finish. I'm using a 600 grit here, wet dry sandpaper. I'm just using it dry, but you can also use it wet if that's what you want to do. You could also use a 400 grit sandpaper, or you could probably go down to about a 240 grit, but I wouldn't go any lower than a 240 grit for this. Now we're going to repeat the process all over again to create a second door. Usually the second door is going to be a little bit easier because you've already got your pattern and the style that you like, and you've already done it once. So basically you know what you're doing, you just need to repeat the steps again. As I did last time, I started off by sanding all of the top of the door down to 240 grit to make it nice and smooth, and then I cut down to size and added the trim all around the outside of the door for the frame. Down in the description, I'm going to put all of the information about all of the different types of timber that I've used and the different thicknesses and width of each of these different pieces. The width of the strip that I used for the frame is a different width to the detail that I've put around the front of the door. And the reason I did this is because on the front of the door, I wanted to use the widest timber panels that I could get. And this is going to create the visual effect a little bit better than if I had used really thin timber. The most time-consuming part of building these barn doors was definitely getting all of the cuts correct and making sure I got all of the measurements perfect so that I could easily slip in these timber details, flush, and create the design. Now with this second door, I wanted to do the arrow reverse of the other door so that when I install the doors, the two arrows are going to face each other, creating a cool visual effect. I then went through with the wood filler again and filled in all of the nail holes, and I also went through with the wood filler and filled in all of the cracks between where I've added the frame to the edging. I let the wood filler all dry, and then I slipped on the battery to my orbital sander and went along and sanded off all of the excess of the wood filler. I then used the blower just to blow off all of the sanding dust. You can use a dust extractor when you're using the sander, but often if I'm just doing a pretty quick job, I don't worry about getting out the dust extractor, and so it's just as easy to use the blower. It's my little helper and it just blows off all of that sanding dust. I do still give it a quick wipe down with the microfiber cloth just to make sure that there's no residue, but it is super handy. I then painted on the clear polyacrylic. I'm using a matte finish because I didn't want the doors to be high gloss. I wanted to have that really nice, smooth matte finish. And so I'm just painting on all of that first coat before I'm going to sand down in between the coats. And then I'm going to use my spray paint to spray on the second coat. The reason why I decided to use a spray can to paint the second coat and the third and the fourth was because when you are using a clear polyacrylic, it's the one substance that you are most likely to get paintbrush strokes in, and I really didn't want to have paintbrush strokes in my top coat on the timber that was going to be visible. You'll also notice that when I'm spraying on the second coat of this top coat, that the door and the timber doesn't actually change color as much as it did with the first coat. When you have a raw timber and then you apply the first coat of the top coat, you are going to notice a deepening of the color of the timber quite considerably. Whereas after you've applied that first coat, when you apply the consecutive coats after that, the color change isn't going to be anywhere near as noticeable. Something to keep in mind with this is if you absolutely love the color of a timber the way that it is, you may need to put a lightening product on the timber, such as a whitewash or a stain, before you put the top coat on, because once you've applied the top coat, you can't then change the color of the timber. Now it's time for us to actually hang the barn doors in the room. First off, I just want to put this out there. This did take me a lot longer than what I thought it was going to. I thought to myself, yep, a couple of hours and I'll have these doors hung. However, it did take me about 4.5 hours to install these barn doors. So before you get started, just know that it is going to take you a fair bit of time. I purchased a complete barn door hanging kit, and it came with all of the components that I needed to be able to hang these barn doors. The first thing that I needed to do was put these hangers on the doors, and I needed to make sure that they were going to be at the exact same height on each side of the door so that my door wasn't going to end up lopsided. When you purchase a barn door kit, you're going to have a whole lot of different components. I'm just going to put on the screen now the name of some of the components that you're going to have within the barn door kit, and you're going to need to install them step by step. So as I mentioned, what I'm currently doing in the video is I'm installing the hangers. I needed to drill the holes for where the bolts were going to go for these hangers, making sure that I double checked the measurements before I did this, and then clamped the hanger in position so that I could then use my drill to drill through. The only problem is because the thickness of my door wasn't the same thickness as a standard door. Because these were a custom build, the bolts then needed to be cut down to size so that I could actually fit the head on the bolt. I put the bolt in a clamp, and then I used my angle grinder to cut the bolt down by about 1 centimeter. If you have a similar problem to me and you do need to cut the bolts, make sure that you thread through a nut along the thread of the bolt. This is going to then enable you to thread the nut back along and make sure all of the thread is still usable. Once they're all cut down to size, take one of the washers, thread it over the bolt, and then push the bolt up through the drill hole where you have just placed the hole in the door. Add another washer on the top, and then you're going to need to tighten the head of the bolt. So you're going to just use it by hand and screw that on a little bit, and then you're going to need to tighten that. You can do this with either a ratchet or a socket wrench. Just make sure you do it up really tight, because these hangers are going to have to hold the weight of all of the door, and you want to make sure that it's really tight. So then you're just going to repeat the process to install the hanger on the top of both of the doors. There's going to be 2 bolts in each hanger. Tighten those up, and then once the hanger's on the door, it's then just a matter of going inside and starting to install the track. For this next bit, you're probably going to need a second person, especially if you have timber doors like I have, because these doors have quite a fair bit of weight in them. For this, I got my dad to come over, and the reason why we're wearing masks is a bit of an odd one, but I had previously had COVID a couple of days before this, and my dad was going in for surgery in a few weeks, and so couldn't afford to catch COVID, so we just thought it was going to be safer for us both to wear masks. We placed a piece of timber on the ground and then sat the door on the piece of timber, because the door's going to have to sit up a little bit to be able to slide. We then used that to get a measurement of approximately where we were going to need to put the track and what height we were going to need to have it. It was easier to get our measurements this way, because then we knew that we were going to have the door at the correct height and that the hangers on the door were going to sit perfectly on the track. We moved the door out of the way, and then I used my laser level to find all of the studs in the house. Because barn doors are very heavy, you need to make sure that when you put the track down, when you screw the track to the wall, you are going into the studs of the home, which is going to give it a lot more strength and support. Now I have a metal frame home, so I used a magnet and went along and marked where all of the studs were, and then I transferred that details down onto this piece of wood that was laying along the ground. I made sure it was lined up so that the center point was in the center of where the doors were going to go. I then transferred the studs from the wall onto the timber, marked it, and then I'm going to go along and drill holes in this timber at all of the points where the studs are. This piece of timber is going to go onto the wall at the back of where the track is as the support piece. Once I had pre-drilled all of the holes in the piece of timber, I needed to get up and drill into all of the metal studs in the house. So I've just got my drill and I'm just going to drill through and put a hole in the metal stud and the wall, where I'm going to then install a heavy-duty wall anchor. If you have a wooden frame home, you're not going to need to do this step and install these wall anchors, because you're going to be able to screw straight in through the piece of timber that you're adding to the wall into the timber studs, and the timber studs in the wall are going to be strong enough to hold the weight of the doors. Whereas in my home, in the metal frame, just screwing a piece of timber onto the metal frame without having these wall anchors is not going to be strong enough to hold the weight of the doors. Once all the anchors had been installed, I then got Dad to help me lift the piece of timber up into place, and then we both screwed in from each side to one of these screws just to be able to hold it in place. I then was able to go back along and tighten up all of those screws and make sure this piece of timber was firmly attached to the wall. Then it was time to finally install the track onto the piece of supporting timber. I needed to work out exactly where the middle of that piece of timber was, and I marked that out. I then got the base of the track, and there's a little button that you need to use to sit in behind the track to hold it away from the piece of timber. You just hold that in there behind and then screw straight through that into the wall. Because I had two doors, I had two individual tracks, and I was able to hold the tracks up by myself while I just screwed this in place. Whereas because the piece of timber was 4 meters long, it was just going to fall down on one end if I didn't have someone help me hold it up. However, even when installing these tracks and putting the final screws in, you could still get someone to help hold the track up if you needed it. I then had Dad help me lift the second door in. We tipped it up and then we put the door in place. The doors are starting to look really amazing, and I really love how the timber really sets off against the dark wall. But we're not quite done yet because we need to install the guide. So the guide helps hold the door away from the wall so that it doesn't bang back and swing into the wall. What you're going to do is you are going to need a hammer drill to drill into your concrete slab if you have a concrete slab. I drilled 2 holes and then I placed plugs in the holes, which were going to be able to hold the screws and support them as I screwed them in. I slid the door back into position so that I know where it would sit, and then I held the front component of the guide and then just drilled that and put some screws in to hold it in place. Once I had the door guides in place, it was just time to install the handles. So I purchased these handles at Bunnings. They are just standard door handles. I took the screws out and then I took the handles off the packet, and then I just needed to measure them and make sure that I had the handles at the exact same height on both doors before installing them. I used my drill to drill 2 holes, one for the top half of the handle and then one for the bottom half of the handle. And once I had those 2 holes drilled, I just sat the handle in place and then used a screwdriver to screw it up at the back. I chose to use a screwdriver to tighten the handles because sometimes when you use a drill to tighten these style handles, you can actually strip the thread and then it doesn't end up tightening. So I find it easier to just tighten it off with a screwdriver and make sure that it's going to fit nice and snug. I then just had to repeat the process on the other door. You'll see that there is a laser level line there, the red line, and I used that laser level just to make sure that I was going to have the handles at the same height on both of the doors. Now let's take another quick look back at this space before I installed the barn doors. It was just a big opening in our former lounge room that we couldn't close off, whereas now I have these stunning timber barn doors that not only serve as a functional feature of our home by being able to enable us to close this front lounge room off and keep it hot or cold depending on the weather, they are also a stunning feature in this room, creating the warmth and also the character that this room was so much crying out for. It doesn't matter whether they're open or closed, they look absolutely spectacular either way. I hope you loved this video and me showing you the process about how I built some custom barn doors. If you love home DIY projects and home styling, make sure you hit subscribe because I've got so many amazing home projects coming up in the future. I can't wait to share them with you, but for now, if you missed out on this beautiful kitchen transformation for less than $2,000, why don't you head now and check it out.